what's happening right now with the Canadian truckers, if it's even right to really call them all truckers, has been getting so much attention. Ben, you've been covering this a lot. You've actually received a lot of praise from those who agree with you and a lot of hate I've seen from
Mostly
those who
hate.
disagree. Mostly hate. Well, it probably feels that way because people online are so loud.
Yeah,
But
just the percentage of it.
yeah, exactly. But so I think, why don't we do this? Why don't you lay out the mainstream media, or maybe not the mainstream media? Why don't you lay out, the mainstream media narrative on the truckers, the sort of pro trucker narrative, and then what's actually happening here as far as you see it?
Well, it's an interesting way you framed it, Rania, because I think it raises this point that, to be fair, the mainstream media is not pro convoy in Canada. But
Right.
also, I mean, the mainstream media was against Trump. That doesn't mean that Trump is good. Like, I mean, the
Yeah.
mainstream media is pro Biden and Biden's awful, but the mainstream media was against Trump. That doesn't mean that suddenly Trump is good. Just because mainstream corporate media is against something doesn't mean that it's good. Like, obviously, we all oppose mainstream corporate media propaganda and war propaganda and all of this, but that doesn't mean that you take a contrarian position where everything that the mainstream media says is inherently bad. Therefore, anything that it's criticizing is ipso facto good. No, that's ridiculous. That's dumb logic. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of the media is against the convoy because all you have to do is go look at any video or photo and you'll see a bunch of right-wing fanatics. And yes, I mean, not every single person participating in this convoy is like a hardcore right-wing nut job, but it is led objectively by right-wingers. It is led objectively by non-truckers, by the way, and we can talk about this. In Canada, 90% of truckers are vaccinated. 90% of the truckers that drive across the US-Canada border, which is what we're talking about here, 90% are vaccinated against COVID-19. And all of the major truckers unions, including Teamsters, which is, this legendary union. It's known for its militancy. It's a great union, a trucker union. Teamsters Canada came out hard against the convoy, calling it led by right wingers, saying that it has elements of racism. And then you see these people say, well, look at this photo, look at this interview of this brown guy or this black guy at the convoy, just tokenizing people, ignoring like all of the right wing nut jobs who are there. And then let's look at the funding sources. So in addition to all of the major unions, the Canadian Labour Congress, Teamsters Canada, the Canadian Truckers Association have all come out against it. We also see that the Indigenous community, First Nations leaders have all come out against the convoy. And furthermore, we see that if you look at the donations are coming in from not only right-wingers in Canada, but right-wingers in the United States. And this is a matter of fact. I mean, this is not a matter of your opinion, your analysis. This is an objective fact that there is tons of right-wing funding coming in. And you can see all these right-wing networks in the US heavily pushing it, especially this guy, Jack Posobiec or whatever his name. I don't know how you pronounce his name, this alt-right guy. He was boasting he changed his name to like Trucker something on Twitter. So now they've all become truckers overnight, by the way. So he was boasting of how there was a $215,000 anonymous donation, a single donation of $215,000 that was made to this GoFundMe campaign for the convoy. Now, I don't know about you guys, but people who have $215,000 sitting around to donate on a single day, that's not working class. We're talking about oligarchs here. And what happened in this campaign? So after this convoy was organized, by the way, it was originally organized by non-truckers. So there were a few truckers who came in, although most of those truckers are owner-operators, and many of them have their own companies. And we can talk about this in a second. There was this brilliant Twitter thread that someone in Canada did showing all of these companies. And by the way, the irony is that many of the company owners that are participating, these are trucker company owners that they employ truckers. So they exploit working class truckers. And their bosses showed up to this convoy. And there was this person on Twitter who did this great research going through all of the photos showing the trucker companies present at the convoy. And this researcher found out that a huge number of those small business owners received money from the Canadian government over its COVID small business program, funding these company owners during COVID. So I mean, it's peak irony. It's like all the beautiful boat owners, the beautiful, Trump, he referred to all of his supporters in Florida as the beautiful boat owners, I think he said. The beautiful boat or whatever. It's just like the Canadian equivalent of that. And it's always cold. So instead of boats, they have trucks. But I mean, as I said, this is not led by truckers. And the GoFundMe campaign that was created for the convoy was created by two right-wing activists in Canada with right-wing parties who are not truckers. So the people who organized the protests were not truckers. The people who organized the GoFundMe campaign that raised over $10 million in 2 weeks, they're not truckers. And then now we actually have this leaked data, which was leaked to the Washington Post, which shows millions and millions of dollars pouring in from the United States from rich areas. And their research shows that the richer a community is in the United States, the more likely it is to give money. And of course, these are all heavily Republican areas. So again, like this is an astroturfed campaign. And Kevin got up this article that I wrote with a friend of mine who's a great journalist in Brazil named Brian Meyer. And what was interesting about our article is that Brian Meyer he pointed out all of these parallels to a very similar campaign involving Donald Trump's network in Brazil and Jair Bolsonaro, the far-right fascistic leader of Brazil, who openly supports the military dictatorship, the fascist military dictatorship that the U.S. helped install in the 1970s and 80s in Brazil. And anyway, the point is that many of the same people and many of the same tactics are being reused. And this was last September. It wasn't that long ago. In September 2021, a bunch of these right-wing networks, including Jason Miller, who was Donald Trump's chief advisor and who's deeply involved with Steve Bannon. I mean, Steve Bannon is deeply involved in all of these networks. And in Brazil, in September, they organized a fake AstroTurf trucker protest, in scare quotes. And by the way, it later came out that most of the truckers who showed up to this protest were actually hired working class truckers who were being paid by a company called ProTorque, and that company is owned by a multimillionaire right-wing Brazilian who is one of the chief donors to Jair Bolsonaro. And Jason Miller, Trump's chief advisor, was in Brazil for a CPAC conference, the conservative conference, which was held a few days before this conference in September, which featured Donald Trump Jr. and featured Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of Bolsonaro, and it featured Jason Miller. So it's obvious that they were all organizing this thing together, that Bolsonaro's one of his top donors bought these truckers, paid off these truckers to send them to Brazil and to the capital, Brasilia. And by the way, the last detail here is that this so-called trucker protest in Brazil was organized by a non-trucker who called himself Thunder Joe in Portuguese. And this guy, not only was he a non-trucker, he didn't even have a driver's license. The guy who organized the so-called trucker convoy on behalf of Bolsonaro. So, I mean, we can't be naive here. And I got a lot of people attacking me for this, but I got to say, it's really striking to me seeing some people, even on the left, who could recognize astroturfed, foreign-backed right-wing protests in Hong Kong, in Belarus, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Syria. Like we've become, Rania, you know this very well. We've become very accustomed to recognizing the astroturfing, the foreign funding, the unorganic elements, the fact that these are like very astroturf protests. We've seen that in Syria. We've seen it in Hong Kong. We're now seeing it in Canada. And what's incredible is seeing some people on the left who were able to recognize that in other countries, but now they're supporting this right-wing astroturf foreign-backed protest in Canada. And why? Because they hate Justin Trudeau. And I hate Justin Trudeau too. Like, just because you oppose the convoy doesn't mean you're pro-Trudeau. And it reminds me, actually, of the whole Assadist thing, Rania. Like, I want to get your thoughts on this because people are saying if you oppose this right-wing convoy, which Donald Trump has been openly supporting, Donald Trump has been openly talking about in his rallies, saying that we should support the Canadian truckers, by the way, most of whom are not truckers. Donald Trump has been releasing emails on his mail list saying that you should support this convoy. And Eduardo Bolsonaro, the fascist son of Jair Bolsonaro, who works closely with neo-fascist forces in Brazil. Eduardo Bolsonaro also called for restoring elements of the military dictatorship, and he called for suspending civil liberties in order to defeat what he called the radical left. So this dude is a total fascist who called for suspending civil liberties, and we're supposed to believe that he's supporting freedom in scare quotes in Canada. So meanwhile, you have these people, some of whom are on the left. The vast majority are on the right, but there's this fringe on the left. Although even a lot of them are not even really on the left at this point, but they claim that if you oppose the convoy in Canada, that you support the neoliberal centrist Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. It's the same logic of the people who say that if you opposed the war in Iraq, you supported Saddam Hussein. If you supported the proxy war to destroy Syria, you're an Assadist. It's the same exact logic that they're ironically using. And I have to say, you know who's one of the best forms of resistance in Canada against Justin Trudeau? It's not the right wing. It's the Communist Party of Canada. And unlike all these people praising the convoy outside of Canada, the Communist Party of Canada is in Canada, and they have released multiple statements condemning the trucker convoy, which is led by non-truckers, pointing out that 90% of truckers are vaccinated, that all of the truckers' unions have come out against the convoy, and that it's obviously astroturfed by the right wing, and not only in the US, by the way, but also hardcore far-right forces inside Canada, including there's this new attempt to try to create like an even more far-right candidate than even like the previous conservative prime ministers they've had. So they're trying to have like their own version of Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro in Canada. And they're jumping on this and trying to turn it into like a massive campaign ad in the same way that Bolsonaro used a so-called trucker protest as a huge campaign ad in 2018 to get elected.
That's a really good point you make about like Assadist versus Trudeauist. That I just like that's actually like I hadn't even thought about that. And something about this that's really been bothering me is there seems to be this sort of strain of thinking, and this is kind of going into inter-left stuff. And again, if we can even call some of these people leftists anymore, where there's this notion that the people who were angry at the Capitol on January 6th, the people who are at Trump rallies who are angry, the people who are at these trucker convoys who are angry, that we as the left, our job should be to appeal to these people because they're angry and their anger is righteous. We just need to move their anger in the right direction. But here's what doesn't make sense about that particular line of argument to me is, first of all, these people are mostly like small business owners. They're reactionary small business owners. These are not people who like the left. And I mean, if you want to, as a communist, go and try to convince people that communism is the right way at rallies like this, then by all means, go ahead. I mean, good luck to you. I just don't think it's going to turn out well for you because they hate you more than anything else. Their signs literally say it. Everything they think is bad is communism. So I don't even know like why that's being left out of that conversation. But moreover, a lot of these same people, and this is more of a comment than a question, but I'm sure you guys will have something to add. A lot of these people will also spend all their time dragging the DSA or dragging anybody on like whatever annoying segment of the left there is, or even liberals. And like, yeah, I can't stand liberals. And sometimes the DSA annoys me, as we've talked about on the show before, because it has like certain left factions I don't like. And sometimes other factions of the left annoy
really
me.
quickly, I gotta add a note because I know I'll get attacked for this by these same people we're talking about who are going to be like nitpicking and looking for everything. But I do have to give a little credit because people have asked me about this. DSA on international issues in the past year or two has very drastically improved.
Yes.
I
Well,
very
DSA
harshly criticized DSA. I mean, DSA openly supported the 2018 coup attempt, the right-wing coup attempt here in Nicaragua. But to be fair, their international committee has become really solid, and their recent statements against war over Ukraine were really good. Their statement over Iran, their statement over North Korea, like they have become so good that actually they're now being attacked by like some of those same people. Like some, I mean, some like the same like regime change libs are attacking them now for being like tankies or something.
And they deserve credit for that. And I'm just noting my past criticism so that I can be taken credibly.
I criticize them a lot. In the
past. Credibly here, I have some credibility here. I'm not like a stooge of the DSA or whatever. The point is to say, like, I feel like a lot of the same people making the argument that we have to appeal to these reactionaries are the same people who say anyone who tries to talk to liberal, like there's no point in talking to liberals, there's no point to talking to people who call themselves leftists who don't agree with us perfect, like exactly. And my question to them is like, why would I want to spend my time trying to, like, I think we should be appealing to everybody in a way, but like why would you prioritize appealing to like racist reactionaries over people who actually agree with you, if you really are on the left, who actually do agree with you on a lot of things. Like, you know, a lot of us were liberals at one point. We didn't go from fascist to leftist. Like I didn't. I was like, there was a time when I was a good liberal. Like that's like kind of how I grew up. I was more left of most liberals, but I was like pretty much liberal. That was like the base I came out of. And so I just find it really strange that there's like this like growing chorus of people, mostly on the internet, who are like,
Entirely on
fuck
the
the,
internet.
who are like, fuck liberals, fuck leftists, fuck the so-called anti-imperialists. We should be appealing to the white working class. Sure, we should be appealing to the white working class. I don't think that these truckers are the white working class, but I also don't think we should be we should be like prioritizing appealing to racists. Like, are you saying the white working class is all a bunch of right-wing racists? And why only the white working class? Like, what about the rest of the working class? Anyways, those are just some things that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Like, why these people but not these people? Like, yeah, I don't like AOC that much either, but I don't think she's the enemy, and I don't think her base is the enemy. I think her base is the people that we should want. I certainly want her base over the truckers, big, quotes around that in Canada, or like people at Trump rallies. Like I have more of a chance of reaching AOC's base than I do reaching Trump's base. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, Rania, I've thought about this so much, and I think a lot of it goes back to the Trump era. And the election of Trump rotted so many people's brains. Obviously, we saw that with liberals, with Russiagate and the Orange Cheeto Man, and being gay with Putin and all this nonsense. But like, it also rotted the brains of some people who were like on the left or claimed fidelity to the left, or at least used to. So, I mean, there are people who openly argue at this point, especially the so-called like patriotic socialists, which is a whole other dumb can of worms. But they openly argue. They say communism is conservative and that we are more likely to win over conservatives than liberals. And they openly say that. And they say that Trump, even though we disagree, even though we disagree with him on all these things, he represents this kind of like radical wing of the bourgeoisie that is going against big capital. And it's like small capital against big capital, which is ridiculous. I mean, that's not historical at all. In fact, small capital is often the social basis for fascism. I mean, what they're really talking about is fascism. And we should understand that fascism is actually, in a strange way, it is a counter-revolutionary, ultra-reactionary revolutionary movement, in the sense that fascism is an attempt, when there's a moment of capitalist crisis, to wage a counter-revolutionary revolution to save capitalism from destruction by bringing back elements of feudalism. But in some ways, it's anti-systemic, but it's extremely reactionary. So what they see Trump criticizing the media. They see Trump, criticizing like so-called liberal elites. Uh-oh. Looks like you lost your power, Rania.
It'll come back on in a second. It's
That's
okay.
how
You
we
can
know
keep
you're in Lebanon.
Okay, Kevin. And I want. Yeah, it's okay. Look, ready? Watch. 1, 2, 3. Ah, there it is. Generator.
Oh, your
Go ahead.
generator.
Sorry. Yeah, that's how you know
Well,
I'm in
anyway,
Lebanon.
the point is that if you look at the history of fascism, oftentimes it is the small capitalists, the kind of national capitalists who don't have, they get their money through, small businesses and domestic industry as opposed to international capital. They're often the social basis for fascism. And they're the ones, again, who Trump called the beautiful boaters, right? The small business owners in Florida who represented like a huge basis of the January 6th riot. And I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the idea that like the January 6th riot was like this crazy thing that was like carefully planned, but like objectively, the vast majority of the people there were right-wing nut jobs. Like they were fascistic. I mean, they believe in QAnon, which is a fascist ideology. I mean, not all forms, like not every neo-fascist is going to be a Hitler saluting Nazi. Like fascism evolves over time. And that's why like also fascism is not all just a bunch of white supremacists. Like in India, you have one of the largest fascist movements in the world, which is led by the BJP party and the RSS. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is a lifelong member of this fascist paramilitary called the RSS, which preaches Hindutva, this fascist Hindu ideology that calls for ending the secular constitution and creating a Hindu Rashtra, which is their version of an Islamic state. The point is that like fascism is different all around the world.
The Japanese were there's Japanese fascism during World War II. Like it isn't as strictly. I just want to throw something out there. Like I'm Lebanese. My family's Lebanese. I have extended family in the U.S. And one of them is a QAnoner, and she's a small business owner, and she's totally lost her mind. She's also a huge anti-vaxxer who like doesn't believe in Western medicine at this point. But anyways, the point is that, yeah, fascism does evolve. I think the reason I just wanted to throw in at that point in particular is because I think that there's this misguided notion, especially when I see people promoting a video by like a brown person at the Canada blockade or whatever, being like, see, it's not like racist. And it's like, okay, but like, and I'm not saying that brown person in particular is like fascist, but there can be rainbow fascism. And I actually think that any future sort of fascism in Western global North countries will have a rainbow flavor to it. It won't be this like, some people will wave around a Confederate flag, but actually that won't be really as so much the basis for it as like just like hating liberals and the poor.
Yeah, and it's also people just have mixed consciousness. Like, let's not forget, like it was not a small number of Latinos, especially Latino men, who voted for Trump after he called Mexicans rapists. And he said all this racist stuff about Latinos. So like people have very mixed consciousness, and they're like, well, oh yeah, well, they're white supremacists, but they're not against me. I'm the exception. And it's just
they're against the poor. They're against the gross poors that are coming over the border, the ones that we hate in Mexico and Cuba and Nicaragua, the ones who took our plantations away. That's who Trump's talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
so the point is, I mean,
Latin Americans.
And there were like racist Islamophobes who try to create this concept of like Islamofascism, and they're obviously dumb and ridiculous. But like the idea that there's not a unique form of fascism in West Asia, which is what ISIS is. Like,
right.
I mean, that's fascism. Like we don't even need to talk about Islam. It's only tangentially related to Islam. Honestly, ISIS is like extremely anti-Islamic. I mean, you can talk to any Muslim and be like, all they did was violate Islamic principles.
It was an extension of like the most capitalist, feudal like lords of the Middle East, the Saudis, the countries.
Well, the fact that you use the term feudal is my point, because the reality is that there is this kind of revolutionary right that is counter-revolutionary, but in the sense that it's very anti-system. And there's a lot of energy and a lot of momentum, and they portray themselves as rebels. Rebel News is this far-right outlet in Canada. And that's not new in history, actually. I mean, it was the National Socialist Party. Like, fascists constantly try to portray themselves as anti-systemic, and they say that the elites in scare quotes are all liberals, right? But no, I mean, like, the capitalists are, I mean, yeah, they are liberals in the right-wing sense of liberal, like the actual definition, but they're not progressives. Like, the capitalist class is often very conservative. And the reality is that there's this attempt to try to create a right that portrays itself as populist. That's the term they like to use. But all they're doing is, I mean, this is just like fascistic policies. And what they're saying is that in order to be a revolutionary, you have to be reactionary. It's this whole rebranding that we saw from this guy, Paul Joseph Watson. I remember a few years ago, he used to say, conservative is the new punk, right? That's the rebranding. And when Donald Trump was elected, it's true that there were huge parts, we should recognize, there were large parts of the U.S. national security state, the deep state, which is real. It's true that there were parts of the deep state against Donald Trump for a variety of reasons, because he was not a good steward of empire, because he would always reveal like whatever the U.S.'s actual he's like in Syria, he was like, let's just take the oil. I mean, he was not subtle. He was a very bad leader in terms of the marketing of the U.S. empire. So it's true that there are elements of the U.S. state against him. That doesn't mean we ally with Donald Trump against the deep state. No, I mean, we have to recognize these contradictions, because there are people on the left who are basically, I mean, the irony is this whole red-brown thing is used by liberal imperialists to say that we should form an alliance with liberal imperialists against the right wing. But now there's actually like this like patriotic socialist bullshit, like or people who say communism is conservative. Like what they're actually saying is we should form an alliance with the right wing against liberals, is what they're saying. And it became so clear over this Canada thing. All the same people who call themselves the patriotic socialists or whatever, who fly the American flag and all this shit, they're all openly allying with the most viciously right-wing reactionaries in Canada. And they're saying that we have to ally with them because they're against the neoliberal government. But it's like, no, you don't have to side with either of them. You can be against Trudeau and be against the hardcore right-wing reactionaries. I mean, but what they've actually like internalized this liberal imperialist ideology that says that you have to ally with the targets of the empire or with the empire. You have to pick one side. They've done like a 180, and they've openly decided that it's easier to win over conservatives because Fox News will have on a white nationalist, Tucker Carlson, who referred to Iraqis as apes and who had on a fucking fascist. I can
Monkeys.
cuss, right?
I
He had
think
on a
I think he
fascist
said
who said that we
monkeys.
should sit on a throne of skulls. Like, this is
Chinese
fascist rhetoric.
skulls. A
And
throne of Chinese skulls.
and every single week, Tucker Carlson talks about like how there aren't enough white people, that there's too many Latinos in the U.S. and we should wage war against China. But he's against war on Russia, and Matt Gaetz is against war on Russia, even though they both want war on China. Therefore, they're populist. Therefore, they're potential allies for the left against
So
liberals. It's
crazy.
insane.
It's so
What
crazy.
they've done is they've reversed lesser evilism, and they said that actually conservatives are lesser evils as opposed to the liberals being the lesser evil.
I've even heard, and then sorry, I know Kevin, I keep talking. I've wanted to have this conversation for so long, and I've kept it in because I know it'll upset a lot of people that we know, and whatever, so be it. But I've also heard a lot of this idea that I've seen people say this, that it's like to what you're saying is the conservatives are like the new punks or whatever. The idea that it's conservatives who are anti-establishment now, and the liberals are all the establishment, so we should be reaching out to conservatives. And it's like, what?
Well, what is the
Are you
establishment? They always say
saying?
establishment because they don't say capitalist class. It's not, the problem is not the establishment. What the hell is the that means nothing. It's purposely left vague. That's why right-wingers
Right.
love that term. The problem is the capitalist class. When you say that, it becomes very clear.
And you know what people don't realize is the capitalist class is in conflict sometimes. And right now, especially particularly since Trump came to office, there's been a very like in your face, on display fracture in the ruling class. And that's a lot of what the COVID fight is about, actually. A lot of the mainstream COVID fight is the ruling class like is at war with itself. There's like the financial elites and like the industry elites. And I mean, that's a really simplified way, like a way to explain it. But I mean, it's just people from different kinds of parts of the capitalist ruling class. Some of them benefit from lockdowns, others don't. And so the ones that don't are anti-lockdown. The ones that do, which happen to be like more of the tech people and the finance people whose businesses and like bank accounts and investments are really tied up in like things that it doesn't really matter if the economy shuts down for them, right? It's like all like things online. That's why it's like so frustrating when people are like, how can you say that the country doesn't want lockdowns, the ruling class doesn't want lockdowns, when Jeff Bezos's wealth went up so astronomically during lockdowns? It's like, okay, but he represents one particular industry. That is not everyone. So like it's just silly. These arguments that are taking place are so silly, and it's like it's like on a different planet.
Also, that same wealth transfer didn't happen in every country that had lockdown. Most countries in the world had lockdowns. And what a coincidence. In the United States, which also had one of like the worst like half lockdowns with all these loopholes. You could like go to church. Like, what the hell? Like, we're going to allow people to go to church with like 200 people in close proximity inside. Anyway, whatever. But the point is that in the United States, there was a massive upward wealth transfer in this extremely authoritarian country where there's little democracy, where capitalist oligarchs control everything, where the government, but there were a lot of lockdowns around the world, and that didn't happen in every country. So like, there's also this problem where people, even on the left, like they're still Americentric. They can't see the world outside of the US. This 5% of the global population, they just can't look past it.
It's amazing. Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, not to mention that the carceral state can't be disrupted, right, Ben? So we can't let prisoners out of these facilities. We're going to let the guards keep going in and out on a daily basis and spread the virus. Like, they're some of the worst spreaders of the virus, going home and coming back to work and going home and coming back to work. But, we have to remain the mass incarceration capital of the world. So, let's move to what'll be our final subject, which is.
But 1 second, I just want to point out really quickly that just on the subject of the Rania hit a key point of the class element of fascism, and what you could just say I don't necessarily think that Trump is like a full-on fascist, but he has a movement that is far right. He is far right. I mean, I would say that maybe he's not explicitly fascist, but there are a lot of fascists who support Donald Trump and see Trump and like his movement as a way to strengthen fascism. And so, and this is historically, like, this is actually the case where a huge part of the class basis of fascism is the petit bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, the people who are the small business owners, lawyers, doctors. There's been interesting historic studies looking at the KKK. The KKK was never a so-called white working class movement. It was the white upper middle class. They weren't like the financial oligarchs of the big banks like JP Morgan. I mean, there was Henry Ford, who was a full-on Nazi, but the reality is that the KKK was led by lawyers and doctors and small business owners and the owner of the local shop. Like, it was like the upper middle class, the people who want to be like the super elite upper class, but they can't quite get there, so they blame black people. They blame immigrants. Like, that's the historically the social basis for fascism. And you look at all these stories of these people who joined ISIS. It wasn't like these poor working class Arabs. No, it was like these like kids who came from like Canadian suburbs who were just like bored in life, and they just decided to go, like, their parents are from Pakistan, and they were like, I'm going to go to Pakistan and go to Turkey and join ISIS and kill people because I'm bored. Like, the social basis for fascism is like this like petty bourgeois kind of class. And they're the kind of people that now are trying to portray themselves as like revolutionaries against the liberal elites. And there are some people on the left falling for this. It's ridiculous. I mean, I'm not saying that we should form an alliance with the liberals, like, obviously not. But the reality is that you have to ask yourself, if you start echoing this lesser evil rhetoric, but for Republicans, and you see people saying that, like, well, yeah, Tucker Carlson's a white supremacist, but I mean, he's kind of against war on Russia, even though he supports war on China. Like, what are you talking? Like, obviously, I don't like AOC at all. I think she's a phony. I think she doesn't really believe in that much. I think her foreign policy has been awful. But if you're willing to like make all of these exceptions for Tucker Carlson and all these other right wingers and Matt Gaetz and Donald Trump and see past like all of the awful things that the other awful things they do to find like the 5% of policies that you agree on them with, well, that's the same arguments that social democrats make for AOC. They say, well, I don't agree with her on everything, but I agree. Like, that's the same logic, that we have to break through that dumb lesser evil
it's like
logic.
worse, but it's like worse. It's worse because AOC never like isn't like actually pushing for war or calling Iraqis monkeys or like it's way less excusable actually to do that with the far right, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Than it is with AOC. Sorry, but like way less excusable.
All right, so let's.
But the moral of the story is Trump melted so many people's brains, and the fact that the entire media, almost entirely, excluding like Fox News and a few outlets, Wall Street Journal, it's true that like 90% of the media, which does lean liberal, was against Trump, and because large parts of the capitalist class, not all of it, but parts of it were against Trump, that like melted so many people's brains, and they were like, well, we have to ally with like the populist right.
It's like the inverse of Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah, it's the exact inversion.
Yeah.